This decade is the decade of African independence. Forward then to independence. To independence now. Tomorrow, the United States of Africa.
One of the most common ideas in Africa is the concept of African unity. Africans believe so much that Africa needs to unite to ward off neo-colonialist influences, the influence of former colonial masters that wants to now subvert the growth of Africa, and at the same time to unite towards collective goals at different levels, economically, politically, socially, culturally. So Africans buy into this idea of African unity. And these ideas is also increasingly gaining ground among African youths, young people in Africa, especially with the ascension into power of figures like Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso, that is a self-proclaimed Pan-Africanist. So in this video, I'm going to be exploring this whole idea of African unity. And I'm going to be revealing that the idea of African unity is not feasible, neither is it practicable, and what we ought to be focusing on instead as a collective group of people. So stick around and follow me as we discuss this interesting yet very profound and important topic. If you're new to this channel, this is ENLIGHTENED-With-Ayowole, where I discuss different issues. I'm just passionately curious and issues that pique my interest, especially concerning African growth and advancement. If you want to discuss African unity and the idea of African togetherness, I believe you have to tie to a figure that personifies this idea or this concept, and this figure is Kwame Nkrumah. But shortly before we go into the ideas of Kwame Nkrumah and his person, see, this idea of African unity and African togetherness did not originate from Kwame Nkrumah. It originated way before him, and one of those that is touted to be the founding fathers of Pan-Africanism or African unity is called W.E.B. Du Bois. Although Du Bois was not the first person to propound the idea of African unity, he was one of the most popular to commonly and actively champion or propound this idea. Du Bois started the first Pan-African Congress in 1909, and from 1919 to 1927, Du Bois he was the architect of 4 Pan-African Congresses. And the ideas of Du Bois essentially was that there was the need for Africans around the globe to unite, Black Africans, predominantly Black Africans. There was the need for them to unite, to ward and to fight against external Western domination. And these ideas of Du Bois was also reflected in other prominent figures like Marcus Garvey. While Du Bois was an African American, Marcus Garvey was from Jamaica, the Caribbean. And you also have others like George Padmore, who was also from Trinidad. So all of these people, in essence, their ideas and their beliefs was that Blacks around the globe, regardless of where they are, they should buy into this idea of African unity, African togetherness, and they should come together in order to fight off Western domination and in order to build a collective future. So Blacks in Africa, Blacks in America, Black in North America, Blacks in the Caribbean. So this was the ideas. If you have been following what I'm discussing so far, you would have started to distill a fundamental flaw in these their ideas. And this is the fact that these people believe that the idea of Pan-Africanism or African unity predominantly or primarily is a unity of Black people. You would realize that in today's world, that's a fundamental flaw, because the idea of Africa as we know it today, with the geographical borders and the sense of belonging, does not necessarily tie to just Black people alone. Africa is so diverse, with diverse racial background and ethnic background. You have Black Africans, you have white Africans, you have Asian Africans, you have Arab Africans, and all of these people are not less African than the Black Africans. So that was the first fundamental flaw in these ideas. And the second being that although not necessarily fundamental or detrimental to their beliefs or to the strength of their beliefs, but which affected how well accepted it was on the African continent, was the fact that most of these people were not Africans. They were from different parts of the world, as I outlined before. They were from America, they were from Caribbeans, but most of these intellectuals, these black intellectuals, were not from Africa. So by the 1940s, this idea of African unity now started to spread to African continent. And then now I'm going to drift back to the person of Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah was born in Ghana in 1909, at the time known as the Gold Coast. And then eventually he found his way to the United States of America, where he embarked on a master's program in nationalism, where he studied the ideas of people like Marcus Garvey, and also engaged in studies in communism, where he also studied the ideas and propositions of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. And Kwame Nkrumah became more deeply invested in politics, in governance. And that was from 1935 to 1939 while he was in the United States. And by the time it was done, before he came back to Africa, actually, he went to England, where he championed for the 5th Pan-African Congress. Kwame Nkrumah was one of those that were actively involved in the planning and the organization of this Congress. And it involved prominent African leaders, including Kenyatta from Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta, and including Obafemi Awolowo from Nigeria. So all of these African leaders gathered in Manchester, United Kingdom, to discuss ideas of Pan-Africanism, Pan-African unity, African liberation from colonial subjugation. And by the time Kwame Nkrumah came back to Ghana in the 1940s, he became deeply involved in politics. He founded the Convention People's Party, CPP, and he was deeply involved in campaigning and protesting against British colonial policies and British colonial actions, up to a point where he was arrested and he was imprisoned for a year. And by 1957, Ghana gained their independence. It was still the Gold Coast. They gained their independence, and Kwame Nkrumah became the first prime minister. And by 1960, they became a republic, and Kwame Nkrumah became their first president of Ghana. And at this point, Kwame Nkrumah had already formed his first stance, because the stance of Kwame Nkrumah on African unity can be largely distilled into two. So the first ideals and a stance on African unity has started to emerge. And the whole idea at this point was the freedom of African territories from colonial subjugation. So he was so passionate about this, so vocal, that his motto was Africa must unite. Not should unite, not may unite, Africa must unite. And he was so passionate about this, giving talks around the world, giving speeches, championing initiatives just to ensure that many African countries that were still under colonial subjugation became free. And around this time, this was a very resounding basis on which to base African unity. Almost every African countries have, at one point or the other, been under Western colonial subjugation. So just with the exception of Ethiopia and Liberia, every other African country have been under colonial subjugation. So even to go a little bit into detail of even Liberia was founded by America, a Western power. So that was essentially, it was just a place for freed slaves in America to return back into Africa. Essentially one of the reasons why they were not colonized. Ethiopia also was under brief colonial occupation of Italy from 1936 till 1941. So they also tasted Western colonial subjugation, but not necessarily in form of full-blown colonization. So you see that these ideals, it was easy for it to spread across the length and breadth of Africa, this idea of African unity, because there was a common cause uniting them. They needed to fight against Western and colonial domination. After a while, they started to achieve this more gradually, and different African countries started to gain their independence. In the year 1960 alone, about 17 African countries gained their independence, and many African countries became emancipated, they gained their independence, some became a republic, and the idea of Pan-Africanism was a resounding success around the continent. At this point, Kwame Nkrumah then moved into his second phase, into his second stance of the basis for African unity. Now that the first major objective has been achieved, of African unity and freedom from colonial domination, and then African states are beginning to gain their independence, new states were beginning to emerge. Then he moved into the second basis for African unity, which is that African states need to unite, not just toward of colonial domination, but now toward of Neo-Colonialism. That is, this is the indirect influence of former colonial masters on their colonies. And also, African countries also should unite and need to unite in order to build this common political structure together. So now this was the second phase of Pan-African unity, the second stance. And now it was at this junction that Nkrumah started to encounter some troubles, because now that many African countries were now gaining independence, new differences were starting to emerge. There were erstwhile not so pronounced. The first being that African countries were diverse, racially diverse to start with. And as I've mentioned earlier, many African countries had like several different racial backgrounds. You have the whites in South Africa, in Namibia. You have the black Africa, which are the predominant population. You have the Arabian Africans in the north. You have those in Madagascar, people in the Madagascar, for instance, that is said that they have more in common with the Maori of New Zealand than they have to people from mainland Africa. You have people from areas like Eastern Africa, like Ethiopia and Eritrea, that they are said to be like a blend of mainland Africa and Asia or West Asia. The second stance of Kwame Nkrumah of African unity started to encounter some major stumbling blocks. One of these is the racial diversity, the ethnic diversity of Africans. Africa has about 3,000 to 5,000 ethnic groups. Is the highest of any continent in the globe. To put into perspective, in comparison, Europe has just about over 160 ethnic groups. So if you can remember, African countries were not necessarily, they were not states or countries initially before colonial influence or before the colonial masters came in. They were separate tribes, separate ethnic groups. So now they were forced to remain the same geographical border to become a country. And these geographical border, these countries, they have different ideals, different values, different political objectives, different political beliefs, different political structures. And even those within these countries, they had varying ideals, and there were tensions within these countries. And even those countries as an entity, they had different varying ideals. So there were some countries that favored a multi-party system, democracy. Some favored single party. Some favored military rule. Some favored monarchies. And you can recollect that many of these African states were coming from the backdrop of colonial domination. So many of them were still trying to form and to clarify their political identity. So these differences were so sharp that at the time that many of these founding fathers of Africa started to have like serious discussion about having like a community, a united African community, and the idea of how the structure of a united Africa, a continental structure, should be framed. But there were two major factions now at this point. On one hand, you had a faction called the Casablanca Bloc, which was led by Kwame Nkrumah, and it involved countries like Ghana, like Mali, like Guinea, Egypt, Algeria, Morocco. On the other hand, you have the other bloc known as the Monrovia Bloc, which essentially involved all Francophone African countries that were colonized by France, and some others like Nigeria, like Liberia, like Ethiopia. So on the one hand, the Casablanca Bloc, they believed that Africa should have a common, a united political front, something that is akin to a federation or a confederation in the least, a tightly knitted Africa, and that national authorities should submit a level of power to continental authorities, and Africa should have a united continental front that controls the political angle and also help in geopolitics with other parts of the globe. And this was the other bloc, which was the Monrovia Bloc, were strongly opposed to this. They believe that Africa, we should focus more on individual sovereignty of African states. every state should maintain their sovereignty, and as much as possible and gradually there can be integration on cultural and maybe economic front gradually. So there was a sharp difference at this point. And as I said earlier, like this, the flaws of Kwame Nkrumah's ideals of African unity, the second phase of his stance, which is based on political cohesion, was starting to become more evident. And Kwame Nkrumah was so much invested in this idea of African unity that to try to downplay some of these differences, his wife was not from Ghana, neither from mainland Africa, from sub-Saharan Africa. He married his wife from North Africa, from Egypt precisely. And he believed that it is so imperative that regardless of these differences, that Africa should still be able to unite politically. And now this brings me to a junction, a very critical junction. When I talk about African unity and Pan-Africanism, what do you have in mind? Because several people can have several conceptions. At the most basic level, African unity, as I'm discussing it at this point, is just the idea that Africa has a lot in common and we should unite towards a common objective or towards a common goal. There are different levels of this discourse. However, at this junction, I'm going to look at the different facets of African unity and assess the feasibility or not of each of those facets. Just three of them, just stay with me. The first very important one is political unity. As I've mentioned, the idea of African political unity is very difficult to achieve because Africa is very diverse politically. And I won't want to rehash or repeat many of the things I've said earlier. But as I've mentioned earlier, the ethnic diversity, the racial diversity, which is also reflected in linguistic diversity. So for instance, Africa has about 1,500 to 2,000 different languages. In South Africa alone, their national anthem has about 5 different languages embedded. So Africa is diverse. The diversity in Africa is unprecedented, and it is like no other continent of the globe. And this diversity reflects in political objective and political system. So for instance, in recent time, because I was talking about in the 1960s, but in recent time, you see leaders like Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso and the Sahel state involving Mali, Niger, coming together, breaking away from the economic community of West African states and forming their whole ideals of political and military unity. So there's this sharp difference in the conception, these political ideals and objectives of many African countries. It's important to mention that many African countries are still suffering from the crisis of political identity. You can still find political tensions, you can still find conflict in countries. Many countries are still not yet definitively secured a political path that they want to chart. So these differences are still obvious today, even probably more than before. So the idea of African political unity is probably impracticable to achieve as at this particular point in time. So I think this will be the least of our focus. We should not waste time building systems and structures around it. We should not waste time investing resources in it. Then the second level of African unity is cultural unity. You see, as I've outlined in this video a couple of times, Africa is diverse. However, I don't think we should throw away the desire to have a common or this idea of a unified cultural identity. We are not the same. We are different people racially, ethnically, linguistically. So there's no point in trying to achieve a false sense of unity or sameness. We are not the same set of people. However, there can be a shared understanding of the beauty in diversity. And this idea that we still share common geographical border and similar historical past in the sense of colonial domination. So I think that this level of African unity should be medium. It's not the least like political. We can invest in initiatives, we can invest in programs, but I don't think it is enough to build systems, enough to build structures, long-lasting structures around it, because I believe it can also be fleeting. Identity, cultural identity, they evolve, they change, so it can be fleeting. While it is important for us to anchor this in programs, in initiatives, to appreciate our diversity, I think this should be at a medium level of energy, while political unity should be at a minimum level of energy. Then this brings me to the third and most important form, level of unity, which is economic and what I term technical unity. Economic and technical unity, in essence, is the idea that while African countries, they have different cultural identities, diverse culturally, political objectives, they are diverse political systems, they are varying. However, there is one thing that many African countries share, and I believe many countries around the globe, almost every country wants economic emancipation. Almost every country wants economic advancement. So this is something that almost every African country share. So there is no gainsaying that this is a fundamental basis on which we can build African unity, economic togetherness, economic unity. There's no point wasting time and energy talking about political unity, investing in it, investing in cultural unity, while just minimally paying attention to the most important of all, which is economic unity. And this is not necessarily new. I'm not going to pretend as if this is a new idea. People have realized this over time. In fact, even Kwame Nkrumah, in his second stance on African unity, was so keen on economic unity. However, Kwame Nkrumah's conception of economic unity was the idea that many countries coming from the backdrop of colonial past were not strong enough to stand on their own and were still susceptible to neo-colonial exploitation. That's so we should unite around, and we should also help countries that are not viable economic entities to help pull them up and to ensure that every African countries are not necessarily on a level playing ground, but are strong enough to ward off extra colonial influences and to also be trade and to also be on the same wavelength as a viable economic entity as other African countries. While this is noble, while this is an altruistic reason, however, the fundamental flaw in this is that many countries are primarily interested in their own national interests first. So if they want to consider other countries, that will be secondary considerations. So you can see, for instance, in recent times, you can see this idea of Britain exiting the European Union. And the major idea was that we cannot continue to sacrifice national economic advancement on the altar of continental economic advancement. We cannot be investing resources in the European Union while our own national economy is suffering. So our priority is our own national economy before a sense of continental belonging or attachment. By 2002 also, the African Union also probably realized this, that we need, and the African Union today, what was previously the Organization of African Union when it was first made in 1963. However, by 2002, different African leaders like Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, they championed this idea that African unity should be anchored on economic growth. They realized this, as I said, is not new. You also come to the realization that our unity should be primarily anchored on economic growth, economic unity, economic cohesion, while at the same time we can also have other structures in terms of like judicial structures also to mediate disputes on the continent. However, when they started to build initiative on this, initiative like the African Free Continental Trade Area, AfCFTA, and when it was created, it was touted that it would be one of the largest continental trade areas involving about 55 countries, trading free of barriers like tariff and infrastructural barriers, and trading freely, generating income. However, this has essentially been a failure, and many of these initiatives has not been successful as it ought to be or as it was proposed at the onset. And the reason is something that is very fundamental, which will bring me to the conclusion in this discourse. The reason why this has not worked out is that because many African countries have not become viable, independent economic entities. Because many African countries, they operate on something that is called trade deficit. Essentially and basically, this means that many African countries import much more than they export. They import from Western countries, European countries, countries outside of the continent, and they do little to produce goods and they do little to produce services. So when you have countries that majority of them, they import, they don't export, and you bring them to a playing field and you say trade, the question is, what do they trade in? It's a very serious discourse, but sometimes I mean, when you realize the purpose and the extent of some of the fundamental flaws in things we are supposed to be building, you realize how funny it can also be. And apart from the fact that this issue of trade deficit, many African countries not being viable trading entities, there were also other challenges like infrastructural challenges, financial challenges, and conclusively, I'm going to propose that African countries, before they can successfully be able to have this economic unity, something must precede it. Economic unity is contingent. That's why I said the unity of Africa should be broken down into different areas. Political unity, the least. Cultural unity, a little bit more than that. Economic unity, we should place more strength on that, but contingent upon countries themselves becoming viable trading entities. For instance, if you follow world geopolitics a little bit, you see countries like United States recently trading, like entering trade deals with Middle Eastern states like Qatar, like Saudi Arabia, China and Russia trading. That is the life wire of relations, of state unity, state relation. The life wire, the life blood is viable economic entities trading and giving themselves mutual benefit. It cannot be a symbiotic relationship. It cannot be a relationship where there is no value to trade. There has to be value to be traded. And every African countries need to focus on becoming viable trading entities, investing in production of goods and services, empowering youth, going deep into research, empowering institutes, educational institutes to be more involved in research. We are in the world of technology, different kind of technology, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things. Empower people to invest in these things, to make groundbreaking research, to build companies, to build corporations, and then these companies, these corporations can deliver goods and services that can be traded. And it is then we can genuinely and realistically say that we want to have a united Africa, beyond a mere abstract concept or a sentimental idea. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you like it, please, I want you to click the like button. I want you to share. I want you to subscribe. And if you love this video also, I want you to stay behind, because I'll be posting more content like this, more provocative content. If you are simply curious and interested in the growth and development of Africa, I think you should click the subscribe button and just watch out for subsequent videos that I'm going to post. Don't forget to share this video also. Thank you.